All right, let's jump into this deep dive on media bias. You guys sent in some super interesting sources, and I'm really excited to get into it with you today.
It's crazy how much we rely on media in our lives. I mean, like for everything, like keeping up with what's going on in the world to, just chilling and watching a movie or whatever.
Totally. And we're like constantly getting hit with messages, right? But do we ever really like stop and think about how those messages are like, messing with our heads? I think this deep dive is really about like giving you the tools to be, a smarter media consumer and like not just for news.
Exactly. Understanding this whole media bias thing, it's kind of like seeing how information is like twisted, like
Yeah.
what they choose to show you, what they leave out, what they emphasize, it all matters. It's even about understanding how like our own worldviews get shaped by the stuff we watch and read.
And that's where it gets super interesting, right? It's not always like blatant lies or propaganda or whatever, right? It's like these little nudges, these like unconscious things that can really like sway how we see things.
For sure. So before we get too far, let's just like define media bias. Basically, it's any like slant, influence, or perspective that colors how information is presented. And the important thing here is that like bias can be totally intentional or like totally unintentional.
That's always tripped me out. How can something be biased if like no one's like actually trying to mislead anyone?
Well, think about it. We all have our own baggage, our backgrounds, what we've been through, what we believe. That stuff inevitably like shapes how we see the world. And this can like totally unconsciously influence how we interpret and present information, even when we're trying to be objective.
So it's like we all have these invisible glasses on,
Yeah.
right? And they color how we see things, and we might not even realize we're wearing them.
Exactly. And that's why like recognizing media bias is so important. It's like it gives you the power to look beyond those glasses to see all the different ways information can be presented. And then like you can form your own like more informed opinions.
That's a great way to put it. It's like a superpower. You can see through all the BS. Your sources actually lay out these five main types of bias to look out for. I want to dive into those.
Absolutely. Let's start with like bias by omission. Okay.
Okay.
So, one of your sources talks about this recent protest, right? And it was covered super differently by all these different outlets. Some made it front page news, others barely mentioned it.
That's like a perfect example of how what they don't report can be just as important as what they do report. All right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Makes you think, what made them decide to cover it that way? What agendas are at play?
This makes me realize I need to be checking out like multiple sources for everything. If I'm only reading one article, I could be missing like a huge part of the story.
Absolutely. Cross referencing your sources, that's one of the best ways to deal with that whole omission bias thing.
Okay, cool. So next type of bias. What about bias by placement?
Think of it this way, okay? Imagine a headline, like right there on the front page, versus like a tiny little article buried deep inside the paper. Just where they put it affects how important we think it is.
Right, right. It's like the media saying, hey, this is what you should be paying attention to.
Exactly. Your sources talk about this example, right? Where there was this political scandal and it was like huge news in one outlet, but then another outlet focused on some positive economic report. Same day, different priorities.
So it's not just about if they report something, it's about where they report it, how much they emphasize it. This is like turning into a detective game.
It really is. And that brings us to like bias by story selection. So your sources discuss how two outlets can cover the same event but tell totally different stories, right?
Oh, I've seen that so many times. Same event,
Right.
but totally different heroes and villains, all depending on who's telling the story.
Totally. They might like choose different quotes to highlight, focus on different parts of the event, or even use like different words to describe the same actions. These choices shape the whole narrative and can like totally influence how we understand what happened.
It's like using different ingredients for the same dish. You can end up with something completely different, even though you're using the same basic stuff.
That's a great analogy. All right, moving on to labeling. So your sources go into how the language used to describe people or events can be really powerful.
I'm super curious about this one. It seems like we see it everywhere, but don't really notice it.
Right. So think about like the words they use to describe a politician. One source might use the word outspoken, right? While another calls them radical. Same person, totally different vibes.
Wow, those words paint such different pictures in my head. Like outspoken sounds strong, maybe even good, but radical sounds, I don't know, negative, kind of
Yeah.
scary.
That's exactly it. That's the power of labeling. It can sneakily shape how we see things without us even realizing it. We need to pay attention to the loaded language used in the media and how it might be messing with our opinions.
All right, so we've got omission, placement, Story selection and labeling. Hit me with that last one.
Bias by spin. This one can be the trickiest to spot because it involves like picking and choosing facts or evidence to push a specific agenda.
So it's not like making stuff up, but more like presenting a like twisted version of the truth.
Exactly. One of your sources gave this example. Okay, so a company's announcing layoffs. One outlet might focus on how bad it is for the employees, right? Another might highlight how the company's trying to help them with severance packages and retraining programs.
So they're both technically reporting on the same thing, but they're emphasizing totally different parts of it.
Exactly. And that emphasis, that spin, can make a huge difference in how we understand what's happening.
This is making me realize I need to be more, active when I'm reading stuff. Like not just taking in information, but actually thinking about what I'm seeing and hearing.
That's the key takeaway. Recognizing these 5 types of bias, that's the first step to becoming a more critical, more informed media consumer.
This has been an awesome start to our deep dive. I'm already feeling way more aware how media can mess with our perceptions, even in subtle ways.
And we're just getting started. In part 2, we'll explore how these types of bias show up in like specific areas, like news reporting, advertising, even entertainment. It's going to be wild. All right, welcome back to our deep dive. Before we jump ahead, though, I think it's important to remember that we're like just scratching the surface here, right? This whole media bias thing, it's not always like black and white, good guys versus bad guys.
Oh, for sure. It's easy to like start pointing fingers, but I think this is really about, leveling up our own thinking skills so we can like navigate this whole media world better, right?
Yeah, totally. So let's dive into some like specific areas where this bias stuff pops up all the time, starting with like news reporting, right? One of your sources really stresses how crucial it is to be aware of bias in the news because it like directly shapes how we understand what's going on in the world, and that can, influence our opinions on all these important social and political issues.
Yeah, it's not just about like staying informed, it's about being informed accurately
Right.
and understanding all the different ways these events can be like spun, I guess.
Exactly. And actually, your sources mentioned a few helpful tools we can use to be like smarter news consumers. Have you ever used those fact-checking websites like Snopes, PolitiFact, or factcheck.org?
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially when I come across a news story that just seems like too crazy to be true or like really one-sided.
Those sites can be super helpful for like double-checking information and spotting potential bias.
So like if I'm reading something and I'm like, wait, is this for real? I can cross-reference it with those sites and see if there's more to the story or if they're like twisting the facts.
Exactly. Another cool tool your sources mentioned is media bias charts. Have you ever seen those?
Oh yeah, they're like visual maps that show you where all the different news outlets land on this like spectrum of political leaning and factual reporting, right?
Exactly. They can give you a quick idea of an outlet's overall bias, which can help you interpret their coverage with like a more critical eye.
It's like having a cheat sheet for understanding the news.
In a way, yeah. But, like, keep in mind, no single tool is perfect. The best approach is to combine these tools with, like, your own critical thinking skills.
So read multiple sources, fact check when in doubt, and think about the potential biases of each outlet, right?
Exactly. Now let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about advertising. Another place where bias can be, like, totally sneaky and pervasive.
I think we all know, like, ads are designed to sell us stuff, but I'm curious how bias plays into that.
Well, your sources pointed out that advertising often relies on, like, tacking into our emotions, our desires, even our insecurities to make a product seem, like, irresistible.
It's not just about presenting facts, it's about creating this whole, like, story that we connect with on a deeper level, right?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes those stories can, like, perpetuate harmful stereotypes or play on our fears in ways we don't even realize.
That's kind of creepy when you think about it. Can you give me an example?
Sure. One of your sources mentioned, like, toy commercials, right?
Yep.
They often reinforce these crazy gender stereotypes. Boys playing with action figures and building stuff, girls with dolls and play kitchens.
Oh, I've totally seen that. It makes you think about how much those portrayals are shaping kids' ideas about like what boys and girls are supposed to do.
Exactly. And it's not just toys either.
Hmm.
Think about like those cleaning product commercials. How often do you see a dude, happily scrubbing the toilet?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Not very often. It's almost always a woman. Like she's the cleaning expert or something.
Right. These seemingly harmless portrayals can totally reinforce societal expectations and limit how we see what's possible for ourselves and others.
It makes you like rethink all those commercials you've seen and how they might have like subtly mess with your own worldview.
Totally. That's how powerful media can be. It's not always about these like in-your-face messages. It's the little cues, the narratives that can like seep into our brains without us even knowing.
Whoa, that's deep. So what other tricks do these advertisers use to, like, play on our biases?
Well, your sources talk about like emotional appeals, right? Think about those like really sad commercials for charities or those scary ones for home security
Oh,
systems.
I know exactly what you mean. They know how to push our buttons, that's for sure.
Right. They bypass all that like rational thinking and go straight for our emotions, making us more likely to, donate or buy whatever they're selling.
It's like they're hacking our emotions.
Kinda, yeah. And another tactic is exaggeration, right? Ads might promise like crazy results, use vague language, or cherry-pick data to make their product seem way better than it actually is.
So it's not always outright lies, but more like bending the truth or leaving out important stuff to make their product look good.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to like be critical of advertising claims and do your own research before you buy something based solely on an ad.
Okay, so we've covered news and advertising. What about entertainment, though? I'm curious how bias shows up in, like, movies and TV shows.
Oh man, that's where things get really interesting. Because even our entertainment choices can like reveal and even shape our cultural values and beliefs.
Wait, so, like, the movies I watch or the music I listen to can actually affect how I see the world?
Totally. Entertainment media is a powerful storyteller, and those stories, whether we realize it or not, can influence how we think about everything, from gender roles to social issues. One of your sources actually mentioned this recent film that caused a lot of controversy because of how it portrayed a historical event.
Oh, yeah, remember that. Some people loved it for its accuracy, but others said it was, like, perpetuating stereotypes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It shows how even something as seemingly harmless as entertainment can be full of bias and can spark important conversations about representation, historical accuracy, and all that.
It makes me realize that I need to pay more attention to the messages I'm absorbing, even when I'm just chilling and watching a movie, you know?
Absolutely. It's not about becoming like a cynic and not trusting anything, but about being a more aware consumer, questioning the stories you're being told, and looking for different perspectives.
This has been eye-opening. We've learned so much about how media bias can, like, sneakily shape how we think. What else is there to explore on this deep dive?
Well, so far we've mainly focused on the individual level, but in the last part, I want to dig into how media bias connects with like bigger societal and cultural forces. It's going to be wild.
Okay, so we've been talking about how media bias, like, works on a personal level, right? Like how it sneaks into our news and even, like, our favorite movies. But now I'm ready to get into, like, the bigger picture, you know?
I like that because media doesn't exist in like this bubble, right? It's all tangled up with the cultural and societal stuff happening around it, like your sources said.
So it's not just about, like, individual journalists or whoever making biased choices. It's about understanding, like, the whole context in which those choices get made.
Exactly. One of your sources uses the example of how gender roles are shown in media. Like for so long, women were mostly portrayed as like housewives or needing to be rescued, while men were, the breadwinners, the heroes.
And those portrayals, even if they seem kind of harmless at first glance, can, like, reinforce these stereotypes and limit how we see what's possible for, everyone, men and women.
Absolutely. Those representations come from like the cultural norms and power structures that have always been, dominant in our society.
It makes me think about how important it is to, like, consider the historical context, right? When we're looking at media, we can't just look at, like, one piece of content on its own. We have to understand the social and political stuff that, like, influenced its creation.
Exactly. And another source you gave talks about how who owns the media can influence the content.
Oh, right. Like how having just a few big corporations controlling most of the media can lead to, like, less variety of viewpoints and kind of silencing voices that don't fit the mainstream narrative.
Exactly. When you have just a handful of companies calling the shots for most media outlets, it can like really limit the diversity of opinions and make it harder for alternative perspectives to break through.
So even if, like, individual journalists are trying to be objective, the whole system of media ownership could be, like, subtly shaping what kinds of stories get told and how they're told, right?
That's a really sharp observation. It shows how media bias isn't always like this intentional manipulation thing, but can come from these like systemic factors that most people don't even see.
This is all, like, mind-blowing, but also a little bit overwhelming, you know?
Yeah.
If bias is baked into the whole media landscape, how do we even begin to fight it?
It's not about like wiping out bias completely, which is, probably impossible. It's about like recognizing that it's there, understanding where it comes from, and developing like strategies to navigate it better.
So instead of getting caught up in blaming people, we should focus on becoming more critical and informed, like consumers of media, right?
Exactly. And your sources have some like practical advice on how to
I'm
do.
all ears.
Right.
What are some like key things we can do to, sharpen our media literacy skills?
Well, we've already talked about diversifying your media diet.
Yeah. Getting out of our echo chambers and like exposing ourselves to a wider range of perspectives, right?
Exactly. Make a conscious effort to seek out news and information from sources that challenge your own beliefs. Don't just skim headlines. Take the time to read like in-depth articles and analysis from reputable sources with different viewpoints.
It's about being like proactive,
Yeah.
right? And searching for information, not just passively absorbing whatever pops up on our screens.
Another crucial strategy is to like be aware of your own biases, right?
We talked about this before, but it's important. We all have those like filters, those preconceived notions that can color how we interpret information.
Exactly. Take some time to think about your own beliefs and values. Like, what are your blind spots? What issues tend to, trigger you emotionally?
That's a good point. If I know that I get like defensive about a certain topic, I can be more aware of how that might be influencing, how I'm understanding the information.
And your sources also highlight, like, the importance of having respectful conversations with people who have different viewpoints.
I think that's like one of the hardest things these days,
Yeah.
with everything so polarized, it's so easy to get sucked into these like heated debates and just, write off anyone who disagrees with you.
But those conversations, even when they're tough, are so crucial for developing a more nuanced understanding of, like, complex issues.
So instead of shutting down conversations, we should be looking for opportunities to like engage with people who see things differently, even if we don't always agree.
Absolutely. It's about listening with an open mind, asking good questions, and being willing to, like, consider different viewpoints, even if they're not your own.
This deep dive has been like a total game changer for me. I feel like I have all these new tools and perspectives for dealing with this crazy world of media.
That's what we were hoping for, to empower you to be a more critical, more informed, and more engaged media consumer.
As we wrap up, what's like the most important message you want our listeners to take away?
Remember, media bias is everywhere. It's not some conspiracy theory, it's a reality we all have to deal with. But instead of feeling overwhelmed or cynical, I want you to, like, embrace the challenge. Use the tools and strategies we talked about to, like, level up your critical thinking skills and become a more discerning consumer of media. You got this.
That's awesome advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of media bias. It's been a wild ride.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you. And remember, this whole media literacy thing, it's a journey, not a destination, right?
Hey.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep questioning the stories you encounter.
Until next time, stay informed, everyone.